So welcome to our financials workshop. I know that the slides are due tomorrow, so hopefully most of you have already at least started on your financials. This is kind of meant to just kind of help you finish everything up and guide you for the rest of the way. So we're going to just start with a quick introduction, and then we're going to go over different methods for financial modeling. Then we're going to teach you how to actually present your financials, and we're going to finish up with just a quick guided exercise. So essentially, the reason that we have financial implication slides is because you want to turn qualitative ideas into quantitative expectations. Nothing's meant to be set in stone because obviously none of us are mind readers. You can't make a recommendation and just assume exactly what the numbers are going to be. It's kind of just meant to show the future financial viability of your recommendation, just showing that you have logic when you make these and that you have actual reasoning and backup for why you think the recommendation will be successful. So kind of, for example, say your recommendation is building a new product like headphones. You have to think about it from every single angle. So for headphones, you have to think about the cost of the plastic, the labor cost of people making it, the technology cost of either Bluetooth or wires. All of that stuff you should consider when making your financial models. Also, you should be able to get data from different public companies, competitors, and industry news. So we definitely recommend using Excel, mainly because Excel and PowerPoint are part of the same software. So it's just really easy to transfer what you make in Excel onto PowerPoint. With that being said, I'm sure most of you are either in CQS 111 now or you've taken it in the past. If not, that's totally fine. Everything that we recommend you do in Excel is pretty simple. You can definitely just Google how to do it or view some of our previous workshops on YouTube. But basically, we say that you should use cell referencing as opposed to hard coding. Hard coding is manually typing in every single number and equation. Essentially, cell referencing just makes it a lot easier because it's shown up on the screen where you use the like equal sum and then the numbers, or you could write like equals B4. If you realize that you made a mistake earlier on, you can go back and just change the one cell that you made the mistake in, and it automatically changes everything else, which is a lot easier than going back and completely changing every single number that you made and redoing all of the work that you've already done. You should also make sure that you're properly organizing and labeling your work. We don't recommend you do all of your financials in just one sitting because that's going to take way too long. And then at a certain point, you do need breaks. So if you're able to effectively organize your work, then when you do take your break and you come back, you can pick up right where you left off and you know exactly what you've been doing. It's also really important to understand the relationship between detail and accuracy, which I'm going to talk about now on the next slide. So you want your financials to be as detailed as possible, but you also need them to be accurate. So you are going to reach a certain point, it's inevitable where you can't find any more numbers. That's totally fine. You need to be able to recognize when you reach this point and accept it, and then just move forward to the next step. So say, for example, your recommendation is building a warehouse in New Jersey. That's great. You can probably find the price of operating or buying a warehouse in New Jersey, the tri-state area, or the northeast of the United States. You're not going to be able to find a specific warehouse in a specific street, and we don't expect to see that. We don't need to see an exact address that you want to buy. As long as you have just a general number of how much a warehouse would cost, that's exactly what we want to say. And I'm going to pass it off to Josh to discuss more modeling methods.
So there's two main modeling methods you can kind of use. So first is the recommendation approach. Second is income statement approach. We'll go through both of these in future slides. But the whole point is like these financial models are meant to show that link between individual recommendations and the whole company. So you can use a combination of these two methods. That's what we suggest. Of course, each has its merits. And personally, I think the recommendation approach is kind of a little bit easier to kind of go about and maybe a little bit more important for your presentation because it shows, you know, the costs and the revenues of your recommendations as opposed to just like the income of the company on its own. But, you know, we'll get into that in the future slides. So, you know, that recommendation approach, looking at the financial viability of one idea, or, you know, in your case of all three of your recommendations, and it's including those like details and critical thinking, you know, think about the different aspects that go into your recommendations and what they'll cost or what revenues they'll bring in. And that income statement approach is like a big picture of future financial positions. So that kind of could include growth rates. You could be looking at how is Apple expected to grow without the recommendations as opposed to how they'll grow with the recommendations. You can look at, this year's income statement and then add in kind of those costs and see, how will your recommendations cause a change? As it says there, false projecting revenues and expenses. That's something you kind of learned within Finance 311. So if you guys haven't taken that class yet, don't worry too much about, projecting out the revenues and stuff. Definitely the recommendation approach is something that anyone can do. Might be a little bit easier for some people. So, whatever approach works best for you, or if you can do both, that's great as well. To kind of get into what these key steps are for each approach, first, recommendation approach. So you want to understand an idea. So you want to fully comprehend the idea before making projections. For example, say you're making that warehouse, kind of taking that idea that Anna was talking about before. So making a warehouse or a factory, well, what goes into this, right? Make sure you're thinking about where you're going to put it, so have a location. That's something that you can look up the cost of, how much is a warehouse in New Jersey? How much is a warehouse in New York? Wherever you're planning to put it. But then there's other things that go into it as well. So think about everything. Well, if you're making a warehouse, then you have to have people working there, right? So how much is that going to cost? Maybe you're going to have to change the land. Are you going to be able to find that perfect warehouse right away? Is it going to be ready for you already? Or what improvements are you going to have to make? Are you going to have to buy new equipment to put in the warehouse? All those kind of little things, they add up, and that's important to kind of think about. And then when it comes to your revenue side, of course, a warehouse might not bring you more revenue. That could just be making it easier for you to sort items. But maybe it's also going to be used as like a fulfillment center. So that means that you can make more deliveries and then you make more money. So think about it kind of that way. Obviously, I don't expect any of you guys to be really suggesting warehouses for, this case, but it's just kind of a basic example to use. So that next step, classify the attributes. So what was the idea? Increase revenue, decrease expenses, both. Don't feel like your recommendation has to be focused around financials. Obviously, the best, recommendation would be helping bring in more people while also,
So I know that Josh just froze. We're just gonna give him a minute and then he'll continue. Sorry about that, everyone. Josh, I think you froze for a minute.
yeah. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Sorry. Wi-Fi is not great. It happens to everyone. So can you see the slide still? Is everything still good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know where I got cut off, so I'll just start with classify the attributes again. Sorry about that. So classify the attributes. What was the idea? Increase revenue, decrease expenses, both. Important to think about it financially, because financial impacts are very important, but don't feel like your recommendation has to do everything. It doesn't have to increase revenues and decrease expenses and do everything at once. Maybe it just increases revenues, but it's also going to increase expenses. So, that's fine. Talk about what's happening there. There's also going to be non-financial things that'll happen. So maybe you're bringing in more customers, or you're retaining customers for longer, which those things will have a financial impact as well, but they're important on their own, not financially. So make sure you're thinking about everything, even if it's not a financial gain. It still could be something really important for the company. So the next, find quantitative estimates for each part. So begin to determine how much ideas will cost or gain in revenue. So basically, kind of like what I went through before with the warehouse, hiring new workers, how much is that going to cost, right? How much is the warehouse going to cost? How much is the land going to take to improve? Like if you need new improvements for the land to make the warehouse usable, how much is that going to cost? Think about all that stuff. And then kind of try to find the best estimates you can. Some are going to be easy to find, if you Google warehouse in New Jersey, if that's one of your ideas, probably going to be pretty standard to find, okay, generally it costs around this amount. Finding how many workers to work in a warehouse. Okay, a general warehouse worker for Apple costs this much. But then there's going to be things that may be a little bit more difficult to kind of plan out. We're going to do an example later where I'm going to talk about one of the really something that was difficult that the MCG team worked on, a financial impact. So we'll kind of go through it then. But there are going to be some estimates that are going to be really difficult to get to, but there are ways to get to them. And finally, summarize, analyze, and check for logic. So is the model positive for the firm? Does it make sense? Is it realistic? Kind of just that basic check just to see at the end, if you're saying that your recommendation is going to make $1 trillion, that's probably not going to happen, right? So make sure that your model is actually somewhat realistic. If you look at it, you could say, okay, I could see that happening. Obviously, like Anna said before, like you're not going to be able to get the exact number on the dot. That's impossible. Get something that seems reasonable that you can back up. You can say, okay, like we got to this number in this way. But to move on to income statement. So first, for the income statement approach, you're going to gather industry knowledge. So understand the current state of the industry and the direction it's moving, and make sure projections make sense with the economy and key competitors. So you could look at, other competitors of Apple, especially for, in the music industry, you could look at like Spotify, or you could look at Amazon Music, stuff like that. See kind of what direction they're moving. Are they expanding? Anything like that. Next, research company goals and history. So understand how the company's been recently performing and why is it performing in this way. So you could look at Apple's income statements for the past few years and see, okay, are they doing well? Have revenues been increasing, decreasing? What about expenses? Is there a reason for this? Stuff like that. And then understand its goals moving forward and possible barriers. One thing important with this approach is Apple is going to be doing things beyond your recommendations. So there's going to be a different growth rate, even without your recommendations, Apple is going to grow, right? So if you're using this approach, you kind of need to factor that in that, okay, Apple's probably going to grow. I'm making up a random number here, but maybe they're growing 10% a year, right? That's something you'd have to like look up and look into to find that actual rate. If that's the rate, then, how much more is your recommendations going to help? Next, use percentages to understand financials. Financial documents are often cluttered with seemingly insignificant figures, and growth rates are easy ways to identify trends. So you can look up growth rates online. I think, Yahoo Finance might have it. There's a lot of different places that you kind of look up and try to find these growth rates. And then you can use the growth rate to estimate, how much is the company growing each year, on its current track without your recommendations. And then add implications of the recommendations. So this is where it kind of comes back to the recommendation approach. So how are the recommendations affecting the expenses and revenues, and add them as a separate line item. So the example we'll show you later doesn't really go through the income statement approach in this way. It was much more focused on kind of the recommendation approach, but still did bring in some income statement aspects. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Use whatever's best for you. Like we said, that's your due tomorrow night. So don't feel like you need to be, going through and finding all the financial statements tonight, doing all this work. If you haven't done this yet, maybe stick to maybe the recommendation approach for now. And then, if you make it to the next round, it could be a great time to say, okay, let's look at the income statements. Let's, develop kind of this income statement approach as well. But whatever works best for you. I'll pass it back to Anna now to go through how to present this stuff.
Thanks, Josh. So now that you guys have been given the background on kind of how to actually make your financials, it's important to know what information you should be presenting to us and what should go in the background as part of your appendix. So what we definitely like to see as part of your actual presentation is going to be any visual figures. So graphs, charts, summary figures. That could be kind of like a pie chart, bar graph, a line graph, any of that sort of stuff. And the reason that we like to see this as part of your actual presentation is one, because it's easy to look at and comprehend, and two, because it's not distracting. So us as the judges will look at it and listen to you. Whereas if we see just a bunch of numbers jumbled all over the screen, we're going to be spending our time trying to interpret that instead of listening to you, which is obviously not what we want to happen. When it comes to your appendix slides, this is where you should be putting your Excel worksheets, so screenshots of what you did step by step and a more detailed analysis. This way, when you inevitably get asked questions on your financials, you're able to pull up exactly what you did, and you can walk the judges through it step by step and just kind of talk it all out. So when it comes to actually presenting, like speaking that part of it, we're not expecting you to memorize every single number that you made. That would be ridiculous and unrealistic. Instead, what we like to see is that you memorized a few key points or a few key numbers. So maybe the overall revenue or the overall profit that you expect the recommendation to make. With that being said, you do also have to be comfortable speaking on both the qualitative and the quantitative aspects. However, you should not be relying on just one team member to make all of the financials or to answer all of the questions. This kind of shows us as the judges that only one of you really knows what you're talking about. On the flip side of that, though, you shouldn't have more than two people answer the same question. So say you're on a team of 5 people and all 5 of you know the answer. That's great. That's exactly what we want. But if all 5 of you answer the same question, it's kind of a waste of time because then the judges aren't able to ask every single question that they wanted to. And honestly, the more questions you get asked, the more beneficial it is for you because it really gives you the opportunity to show us that you do know exactly what you're talking about. Also, you should make sure that you don't overload your slide with too many numbers. That just, again, like I said on the previous slide, it's going to be distracting and it's going to make the judges be too busy reading the slide instead of listening to you. So here are two examples of professional graphs. Obviously, you can tell just by looking, the one on the bottom is a lot better than the one on the top. So as I said before, Excel and PowerPoint are part of the same software. So it's really easy to remain within the same theme, meaning the color scheme as well as the font. Basically, if you have your chart look kind of like the one on the bottom where it matches the rest of your presentation, it really just shows us that you actually made it and you didn't just find it online somewhere. And also it just flows a lot nicer with the overall PowerPoint. Also, you should make sure that you indicate important dates and use labels. So kind of what I like to say is that your chart should be able to be understood without the context of your presentation. So the one on the bottom, just by looking at it, I can tell that this is telling me the value of a PlayStation based on the model. This presentation is nothing about PlayStation, but I still know what the chart is telling me. The orange one on the top, I have no idea what it's talking about. It just says PlayStation value and then some random letters and numbers. So you should definitely aim for your chart to look more like the one on the bottom than on the top. Also, you should remove stock formatting, which is going to be kind of the grid lines in the background. Essentially, this just makes it look a lot cleaner and easier to read. It's less distracting. If you don't know how to do this, it's a really simple step. You can just go into Google, type how to remove grid lines on an Excel chart. I think it's like a two-step process. You can definitely figure it out. And with all that being said, I'm going to pass it back to Josh to go over our guided exercise.
Thanks, Anna. So here's a guided exercise. This is kind of a really high level example of what financials could look like. So don't feel like you need to do every single thing here. Just kind of give you guys an idea of what financials could look like. And say you guys do make it to the final round, maybe shooting for something like this would be something attainable. So let's get started. So in a recent case study involving Walmart, MCG Consulting recommends that Walmart implements one-day shipping through a subscription service that's similar to Amazon Prime. So a few key questions to be answered. How do we project how much money it will cost to implement one-day shipping, and how much money will the company make from it? How well does this fit into the financial projection of the whole company? And is our recommendation logical and sustainable? So before we even get into any numbers, it's breaking down the idea. So you remember from the recommendation approach, you want to break down the idea, think of the different things. So I'm going to hit a few of these key questions. Some of them are more basic, like on that last box, how many customers will be retained as a result, and what is the revenue gained from our loyal customers? That's something that could apply to many different recommendations. Obviously, it's pretty important to think about, are a lot more customers coming in? Is there a lot of revenue coming in? But it's not something really specific to this recommendation. So that's kind of something that you guys can think about with your recs. Are you getting more customers? Are you getting more revenues? But kind of starting on the left with the first box, would Walmart customers value one-day shipping? So is this something that they want? How many people want it? And then also looking at that subscription price. Will a lot of customers want it, even if it's a high subscription price? How are we going to ensure that customers are going to want this one-day shipping, subscription, and also be making money off it? So that's kind of that first box. That second one, who can Walmart partner with to implement one-day shipping, and how can we ensure products are delivered on time? So Walmart by itself wouldn't be able to do this, unfortunately. So bringing in another company to help with the one-day shipping, that's something that we did without our recommendations. We'll explain that when we kind of get to the next slide. Third box, what are the costs associated with one-day shipping, and how will expenses differ between one-day shipping and normal shipping? So once again, kind of thinking about the differences between what would happen if we didn't implement this recommendation compared to what we did. Also, say people don't want to get the subscription, is going to cost them more money to get things shipped to them. Factors like that. And then obviously, like I said, the last box, a lot more basic, but something you guys can think about, customers and revenue, expenses, all stuff to kind of keep in mind when constructing your financials. So here's the quantitative justification. So this is just the expenses for this recommendation. I'll start with the slide takeaways, and then I'll go through kind of stuff on the right. So this is an appendix worksheet. These were actually two worksheets. The top three boxes were on one appendix slide. Bottom three were on the second appendix slide. So we had a lot of information, so we had to split it up. This worksheet tracked the increase in users while also finding the average online order cost. Once again, I'll go through that when I go through the stuff on the right. Estimates were pulled from Deliver, who would be performing the delivery. So kind of addresses that question from before of who's going to be running this, who's going to be able to do this one-day delivery. Well, it's this company called Deliver. So that's something we explained in our presentation, but was really important for the financials. And then last thing was setting the sources to add a dimension of reliability to the forecast. So we also estimated costs from Amazon, as said in that third bullet. So for Deliver, we estimated costs based off their kind of current costs for delivery. But then Amazon we used as kind of a basic, level of information to kind of estimate, okay, we know Amazon Prime works. Let's kind of convert that to Walmart standards and see if we can get a basic number. So to kind of clear it up, we'll go through the boxes on the right. So we'll go through real quick. First box, delivery costs. So we estimated kind of the average cost per item. And then we added that $5, which is a cost for one day shipping. So the average cost per item would be $13, right? So that was pretty simple, wasn't too bad. A lot of that information was on Deliver's website, so pretty easy to find. Next, that second box, the percentage of Walmart workers based in the US was 68%. So for this box, we weren't able to find how many Walmart customers were in the US. And this was just going to be a US program. So to kind of get to that, we were able to find the number of Walmart workers in the US. So that was 68%. And then we multiplied that by the total number of Walmart customers to get an estimate of the Walmart customers in the US. Like, we talked about before, obviously that number is probably not exactly correct, that 180 million, but the logic is there. It makes sense how we got to it. So, when you're presenting that to the judges, they'll say, okay, they weren't able to find the exact value. We can understand how they got to this. It makes sense, right? So think about that when you're doing your financials. If you can't find a number, is there a way like that to get to it? Can you backtrack into it? Can you do anything like, anything to kind of estimate it and find kind of the best way you can? So then to find the number of people who would be ordering online, we looked at the e-commerce as percent of total revenue, estimated that percentage of users use e-commerce mostly. So it was around 8 million. Then we went to Amazon. So Amazon has 63% of their users are Prime users. So we estimated that would be around the same for Walmart. And then there we go. We got the users who would use the Walmart subscription, 5 million around. So that was a key number that we needed. And we had to kind of use a lot of different metrics in order to get to it. We used percentage of Walmart workers, we used stuff from Amazon, it was a lot of estimation there, but it still comes out to a number that would make sense when you're talking to the judges. And then next box, we were looking for items bought. So we just kind of, once again, used Amazon. We looked at how many Amazon Prime users spent per year. Walmart items cost 2.6% less. So we estimated that Walmart Express users would spend, that $1,363 per year. And then an average Walmart item cost, which we found online, divide, the amount they're spending by the cost to find the items bought. And then using this items bought and the average cost from Deliver, we were able to estimate the items in millions per year that would be sold. And then that cost to us, how much it's going to cost to deliver this. So as you can see, year one was 1 million, 1 billion. And then, and so on. And then we also did a percent increase in users. So we estimated that there would be it wouldn't just be the same amount of users per year, it would increase over time. And we estimated that 5 million users would be achieved in 5 years. So we also factored in the percent increase. So there's a lot of different things going on here. Don't feel like, if you miss something or don't understand it fully, no worries there. It's more to just show you can definitely get to numbers. You can backtrack into them. You can find ways to estimate them. You can use other companies like how we used Amazon Prime to kind of estimate things for this. So there's a lot of different ways to get to your numbers. So don't feel like, if you look it up and you can't find anything, try to think about it. Maybe Spotify's done something similar. Let's see, how much it costs them. Maybe it'll be around the same for Apple. Stuff like that, where maybe it's not the best way of finding the number and it might not be exactly right, but it makes sense where you can present it to the judges and they'll say, okay, I get what they're going for here. We can understand where the financials are coming from. Moving on to revenues. This is a lot simpler. As you can see, last slide had a lot going on. This one's a little bit less. So maybe your recommendation will be more like this, where you're not going to need to do too much work. It's just a little bit of estimation. So key slide takeaways, once again, appendix worksheet. This was all the appendix. Worksheet estimated the number of users who would use the subscription service, and from this calculated the revenue per year. Another key thing to realize, some of this was pulled from the expenses as well. The number of users, we only had to calculate that once. We had that from when we did the expenses. So it was pretty easy for us to find find, these revenues because we already had, that Walmart Express users spend per year. We calculated that on the last slide. The number of users calculated on the last slide. So really the only big number we had to come up here with was the subscription cost, which was $96 a year, and then kind of multiply that. So if you do a really good job and say, your expenses were really hard, it took you an hour to do them, it was a lot of work, it's going to help you a lot for your revenue. So don't feel like if you spend so much time on your expenses that, you don't have any time for your revenues. Usually they're going to kind of go a little bit hand in hand, where if you're spending money on something, you're probably going to be getting some money out of it in some way. It might not be exactly like this where, you'll have numbers calculated specifically, but by doing the expenses, we had the number of users already. We already had the amount that Walmart Express users would spend. So it made it a lot easier on us to say, okay, we have these numbers already. Let's just multiply them together with the revenues. So that's the key takeaways from there. Moving to the next one, implementing ideas. So this is how I personally put out my expenses when I'm trying to figure out for a recommendation approach, how much it's going to cost per year. So just focus on recommendation 1 up here. We had 2 other recommendations for this, but we're not going to go through those expenses and revenues. We're just kind of focusing on that 24-hour delivery. So once again, this is an appendix worksheet. We'll show you what was on the actual slide, just a graph of it soon, but this was once again in the appendix. And it defined expenses for individual recommendations. So as you can see, expanding partnership with Deliver, you kind of saw a little bit of that earlier in that expenses slide. So, we had to look up how much are we going to have to pay Deliver, how much more are we going to have to pay Deliver in order for them to be able to do these 24-hour deliveries. Second one, implementation of new fulfillment centers. In order to, have one-day delivery, you'd have to have a lot more centers that would be able to kind of, these delivery drivers could go in, get the stuff and deliver. We estimated that it would be around 500 million. Once again, for that part, we didn't really show out those really thought out expenses for. It was more of, we looked it up, we found a number that was similar and decided to use it. So that's definitely fine. If you find a number that's similar online, make sure you throw it in your appendix, make sure you talk about where you got it from, but it's all right to kind of use those estimates. Next is the delivery cost. So that's what we talked about on the 2 slides ago. This right here, the delivery cost. As you can see, it's a lot. It's in the billions. It's going to be a lot of money, but that's why we put so much effort into, calculating the financials, because the more money you're going to be spending, the more likely you're going to get questions about it, right? If a recommendation is pretty cheap, or, it makes sense for it to be cheap, the judges will probably say, okay, that makes sense. We don't need to ask about it. But for this one, it's in the billions. We got a question about it asking, how did you get to this number? Why would it be so expensive? Is it going to work out in the long run? All those, and having these really thought out financials made it so we were able to answer these questions. And then finally was a marketing campaign, which once again, something we just kind of looked up, estimated how much it would cost per year. For revenues, same kind of thing. We looked at increased sales and subscription revenue. Of course, increased sales isn't really revenue from the recommendation, but we didn't want to show it at such a massive loss, right? So, directly, it wasn't a direct thing from having this 24-hour delivery. 24-hour delivery does not lead to these increased sales, but we were saying that since there was 24-hour delivery, more people would be wanting to use Walmart, use the service, and as a result, there'd be more sales. So you can think like that as well. Don't feel like there's not going to be any revenues. Maybe you're recommending something like this where you're thinking, oh, well, there really isn't any. Think about what impacts it could have if it's bringing in more customers, like we assumed ours is going to do. Okay, well, how much more money is that going to bring you in if you're bringing in these new customers? So you can think about it in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be just pure, for this, the main source of revenue is that subscription revenue. But we also wanted to think about, okay, more customers are coming in. How is this going to increase the sale? This further analysis and logic check. So here's our net income. Once again, this was all in the appendix. This wasn't something presented. If we had presented it, I think the judges would not have heard a word we said. They would have been focusing too much on what they were reading. So this appendix slide, last slides were really busy, like I said. So this helps summarize our recommendations, and the symmetry between models and slides helps convey our points easier. So net income calculations, simply, we just had added up all the revenues for the first recommendation here, added up all the expenses for the first recommendation, had the total gain for all 3 recommendations here, total gain and expenses for all 3 of the recommendations here. And then we'd use self-referencing. So this was just equals, this minus this. And you can see it's a negative number. It did go down at first. And we'll go into that when I show you guys the graph, but it doesn't always have to be positive. Just make sure that when you're talking about, why is this going to be helpful? Why would you want to take that expense? Well, it's because later, you can see that we're increasing our revenues later, and it's going to continue to increase, and that's going to bring in a lot more revenue. So you can talk about it that way. Don't feel like your revenue has to be going up the entire time, your profit has to be going up the entire time. It's okay if in the first few years you have to take in a lot of expenses. It could happen. Just make sure that in the end, you're reaching some sort of break-even point, or you're showing that, the profit's starting to go up, something like that, to show, okay, it might not start right away, but we're going to get a lot of profit out of this. Next, presenting recommendation model. So this is just one of the slides we had for the 24-hour shipping. The reason we put it on here was just more to show you guys, like down here, like we had 28 billion over 5 years. That's how much it's going to cost. Break-even point was in 2024. How's it subsidized through subscription? So using key figures like that on a slide helps to show different details to the judges without, and it doesn't really show the long-term patterns, which is what your graphs are going to be, but it's little details like that that are kind of important for them to say, okay, I can understand, how much this costs now. I can see that even though it costs so much, you're going to break even soon after, right? Or not soon after, but a few years after. How are you subsidizing it? Oh, okay, you're doing it through subscription. Little things like that where you'll put a number like that 28 billion to show the judges, okay, it's going to cost a lot, but we'll explain it later in the financials. We just want to talk about it now real quick while we're talking about the actual recommendation. If you have a really important financial aspect, you can put in your slides, in your recommendation slides. It is nice as a judge to see, okay, we're going to see a graph later, but I know this is important. They brought it up here. They explained why it's such a high value. Now I know for later, I don't need to be asking them a million questions about it. They really explained here, okay, it's going to be 28 billion, but here's why, and being able to reference individual points of data and then scale it up to the big picture helps provide clarity and depth. So like I said, here we have the 28 billion, very specific point, but later with our graph, you can see the impacts of all of our recommendations. You can see the impacts of this company as a whole. So I think that's the next slide. So actually, we'll get into that right now. Just to say real quick off the bat, this is including all of our recommendations. So recommendations 2 and 3 are in here as well, whereas we've only gone through really, that first recommendation, which is fine. But this was looking at net income for Walmart with and without the recommendation. So the blue line is with the recommendations and gray is without. So we estimated out, what was Walmart going to look like in the coming years, right? We estimated that it would be without our recommendations, even going on a decline, and then, eventually starting to gain more profit. But then with our recommendations, you can see that's a really steep decline from 2020 to 2021. They're losing a lot of money because of that first recommendation. But then you have that break-even point in 2022. That's where it's the same as it would have been without the recommendations. And then you're going to keep going. Not a break-even point, but sorry. You're reaching the same point as you would have if you didn't have the recommendations. And then as you keep going, the profit's going off. So you'll eventually break even on the recommendation, and you're going to, Walmart will get their money back and then some. So then kind of focusing on that stuff on the left, using a graph helps show financial trends rather than details. So that big picture, this shows that big picture really well. You can see, okay, Walmart overall is going to be making 3.6 billion in 2020, but then it's going to go down to 2.7 billion in 2021. Gives you the general idea, gives you an overview. Usually I like to say, put some stuff on the left side. Here we have slide takeaways, obviously, but maybe put some key points that you maybe want people to know. So you could say for, recommendation 1, it would lead to revenues of this amount. From looking at this graph, I wouldn't know how much revenue is coming from each recommendation, which is fine. It's good to show that big picture, but maybe on the left, you kind of explain some key metrics. That's something that could really help the judges say, okay, I see the big picture and there's some small details. That's great. I understand how this works, right? Access alterations and creative coloring can help further emphasize the point. Like Anna talked about earlier, make sure, your graphs look clean. We don't have any grid lines, there's no borders, we have labels, all that. Another thing that I think is pretty important on this slide, you can see right here, this one's in bold, right? That's when our break even is, right? That's when we're pretty much at the same point with the recommendations as we would have been without. We took that massive loss for implementing this new program, but it only takes 3 years to really get back and say, okay, we're in the same place we would have been without it. Now we're going to make a lot more profit. So as you can see, like it may not look the best at the beginning. Obviously, if you could only see those first 2 years, you'd say, why are you recommending this? You're losing so much money. But it's about showing that long-term effect of, okay, in the end, this is going to lead to so much more revenue and more profit for Walmart that it makes it worth it. Remember to label the time periods and units your graph will show. So, on the left in millions USD, bottom is just the expected for 2020. So 2020 is just 2020 expected. This case took place before 2020. So that's why it was just expected for that year. And then can include text boxes summarizing what is happening in graphs. So that's kind of what I talked about before. You can have some stuff on the left showing you, key metrics or stuff like that might not be as big picture, but little details that might help the judges. And then I think this is the last slide. So, sorry to talk your ear off for so long, but financials definitely do have a lot to them. They're pretty important. So, obviously this was a really high level example, took a really long time to do. So don't feel like you have to be doing all of this. Do the best you can with the time you have left. Estimate the best you can. Obviously, you could get a question or two from the judges. Make sure you can explain it. Having these appendix slides, like it says, answering questions, having an appendix with a bunch of appendix slides is going to help so much. For example, if I tried to, answer a specific question like, oh, how much are the expenses for 2020 for that first recommendation? I can't do it off this graph, right? That's why we have those appendix slides. It's to be able to go in and say, okay, you saw that graph. Let me show you a more broken down image of what this is going to look like. So just to look at the pictures we have here, table of contents. That's always good to have. Kind of right after you have your thank you question slide, you can go to the table of contents. It's also nice to have because judges could look at it and say, oh, I see, your number one is the historical income statement. I didn't even think to ask a question about that, but maybe I should. They have the information. Maybe they can clear something up for me. That makes it easier for you because since it's in the appendix, you've obviously, you've thought about it. You kind of know what the slide's about. So when you go into it, if they ask, oh, can you show me a historical income statement? Can you explain kind of like what you used it for? You put it in your appendix for a reason. So it's going to be an easy question for you. You just explain what you did, explain why it's there. That's a pretty easy question to, get and something that could really help you in that Q&A. That second one, historical income statement. That's kind of what the income statement approach is. I know I didn't talk about it that much within the slides I did, but as I said, I do like focusing on that recommendation approach. It is important to look at the income statement, but more to see, do your recommendations make sense? Are you spending too much money? Like those billions we spent on that 24-hour shipping, we looked at the income statement to say, okay, do we have the funds available to do this? Is this possible? And we decided, yes, it is. And then also for our graphs, we ended up, using growth rates to figure out, what the future years of Walmart would look like. That's something that could take a while, especially if you haven't taken a finance class yet to kind of figure out. So don't worry too much about it yet. Like obviously you guys have like a day till you have to submit your presentations tomorrow night. So do what you can, and then obviously if you guys move on to future rounds, we'll be helping you guys out even more. So, we can help you out with kind of doing that income statement approach or helping you with your financials after that first round if you make it to the second. So do the best you can, but we understand that you only have a day after this. Hopefully you guys have started already, like Anna said, but this should be kind of how you're focusing from now on. So then bottom two slides are just salary expense, advertising expense, random other, financial stuff. I just wanted to throw on there to say, there are a lot of different slides. Whatever you do, that advertising expense doesn't have too much on it. It's still important. Have it there. You could get a question. You never know. You already have it done, right? If you make your financials, throw it all in that, appendix slide. It can't hurt. And it looks great if you can pull it up during those Q&As. So slide takeaways, just a real quick wrap up. An appendix is additional information and details that are not in the presentation deck. So all those things on that table of contents we didn't present any of them, but it kind of backs up what we presented, in our first slides with the ones we actually presented. So, don't throw something in your appendix that should be presented during the actual presentation and vice versa. Like this stuff on this slide, don't put that in your actual presentation. You don't want to be reading from a chart or from one of these, from one of these charts this whole time. You want to be able to show the graph. You want to be able to show something that's easy for the judges to look at real quick and then listen to you. Table of contents is a nice way to organize the appendix. Like I said, also, like I said, could lead to the judges asking a question. Would make it a lot easier for you guys because if we ask a question about something you already have prepared, pretty easy for you to just kind of say, okay, this is what we did. And finally, every team member should have an idea of what is in the appendix so that you could reference the appropriate slides when answering questions. So it's good to have that table of contents, because then you can say, okay, they asked about, for example, delivery expense. I can look at my table of contents and say, okay, that's on slide 30. Whoever's controlling the slides, I can say, can you bring us to slide 30? We answer this question. And yeah, so I know I just probably blabbered for a while, but it's pretty important. Your financials, like I said, do the best you can. Try to use one of those approaches. If you know how to use growth rates and stuff, great. If not, that recommendation approach is really kind of more of an important one, because we want to know about your recommendations more than anything. If you can tell us exactly how much your recommendation is going to cost and how much it's going to bring in revenue, obviously, estimates of that, but that's going to be pretty impressive. The judge is going to be like, okay, they've obviously thought this out a lot. So do the best you can. Try to think about your recommendations as in depth as you can. But that's kind of all we have